The thunder of galloping hooves echoed through the dusty streets of Silver Ridge as Mason Turner rode into town, his weathered hat pulled low over his eyes. The year was 1875, and the Montana Territory was as wild as the untamed horses that roamed its vast plains. Mason had been on the trail for weeks, driving cattle north from Texas, and his body ached for rest, a hot meal, and perhaps a whiskey to wash away the dust of the long journey. Silver Ridge wasn't much to look at: a main street lined with wooden buildings, a general store, a small bank, the sheriff's office, and at the end of the street, the Silver Dollar Saloon. The saloon's swinging doors beckoned to him, promising temporary relief from the hardships of the trail. Mason dismounted his chestnut stallion, patting the animal's neck before tying him to the hitching post. "Rest easy, Thunder," he murmured, his voice rough from disuse. He straightened his back, feeling the familiar weight of his Colt revolver on his hip, and made his way toward the saloon. The piano music and raucous laughter hit him before he even pushed through the swinging doors. Inside, the air was thick with tobacco smoke and the scent of cheap whiskey. Men sat at tables playing cards while others stood at the bar, downing shots as if tomorrow might never come. A few working girls moved among the patrons, giggling and flirting, trying to earn their keep. Mason made his way to the bar, his spurs jangling with each step. "Whiskey," he said to the bartender, placing a coin on the worn wooden surface. The man nodded, pouring him a glass of amber liquid. As Mason took his first sip, savoring the burn in his throat, he heard a commotion from the other side of the saloon. A woman's voice, clear and defiant, cut through the din. "I told you, Mr. Hargrove, I am not interested in your proposition." Mason turned to see a young woman with fiery auburn hair pulled back in a simple bun. She wore a modest dress of deep blue, and despite the plain attire, there was something striking about her. Her chin was raised, her eyes flashing with determination as she faced a red-faced man in an expensive suit. "Come now, Miss West," the man slurred, his hand reaching out to grasp her arm. "A pretty little thing like you shouldn't be so choosy. I'm offering you a way out of this God-forsaken town." "And I'm declining," she replied, pulling her arm away. "Now please leave me be." The man's face contorted with anger. "You think you're too good for me, Theresa West. Everyone knows what kind of woman you are. Your father was nothing but a drunken prospector who gambled away everything, and your mother, Mason, didn't hear the rest." He had set down his glass and was moving across the saloon before he even realized what he was doing. Something about the woman's dignity in the face of such crude behavior stirred something within him. "The lady asked you to leave her alone," Mason said, his voice quiet but firm as he positioned himself between the woman and her harasser. The man, Hargrove, looked Mason up and down, taking in his dusty trail clothes and weathered appearance. "This ain't your business, Cowboy. Move along." "I'm making it my business," Mason replied, his hand hovering near his holster. "A gentleman would respect a lady's wishes." Hargrove laughed, a harsh sound that grated on Mason's ears. "Gentleman, lady, you don't know who she is, do you? Theresa West is nothing but a—" Mason's fist connected with Hargrove's jaw before he could finish the sentence. The man staggered backward, crashing into a table and sending cards and chips flying. The saloon fell silent, all eyes turning to the confrontation. "You'll regret that," Hargrove spat, wiping blood from his lip. He snapped his fingers and two burly men stepped forward from the bar. "Teach this cowboy some manners." The first man lunged at Mason, who sidestepped and delivered a solid punch to his ribs. The second grabbed him from behind, but Mason threw his head back, connecting with the man's nose with a sickening crunch. More men joined the fray, friends of Hargrove eager to curry favor or simply looking for a fight. Mason found himself surrounded, but he wasn't a stranger to bar fights. He'd been in his share of scrapes from Texas to Montana, and he knew how to handle himself. What he hadn't expected was for the woman to join the fight. Theresa West grabbed a bottle from a nearby table and brought it down on the head of a man who was about to strike Mason from behind. The bottle shattered, and the man crumpled to the floor. She met Mason's surprised gaze with a small, fierce smile. Together, they fought off the attackers. Mason threw punches and dodged blows, while Theresa used whatever was at hand: chairs, bottles, even a spittoon to keep the men at bay. When it was over, Hargrove and his cronies lay groaning on the floor, and the rest of the saloon patrons watched in stunned silence. The bartender, a stout man with a bushy mustache, looked at the destruction with a sigh. "Miss West, I think it's best if you and your friend leave for the night." Theresa nodded, straightening her dress and tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "I understand, Mr. Jenkins. Send me the bill for the damages." She turned to Mason, her expression unreadable. "Thank you for your assistance, Mr. Turner." "Mason Turner," he replied, adjusting his hat, which had somehow stayed on during the entire scuffle. "Well, Mr. Turner, I believe I owe you a drink at the very least, though perhaps not here." She glanced around at the overturned tables and broken glass. Mason felt a smile tug at his lips. "I'd be obliged, Miss West. Lead the way." They left the saloon together, stepping out into the cool night air. The stars shone brightly overhead, and the street was quiet except for the distant sound of a dog barking. "There's a small cafe at the end of town," Theresa said, walking beside him. "The owner is a friend of mine. She won't mind us coming by, even at this hour." Mason nodded, falling into step beside her. "You handle yourself well in a fight," he observed. "Not many ladies I know would have jumped into a saloon brawl like that." A small laugh escaped her. "I'm not like many ladies, you know, Mr. Turner. Silver Ridge isn't kind to the faint of heart, especially not to a woman on her own." Her words intrigued him, but he didn't press for more. They walked in companionable silence until they reached a small, tidy building with a sign that read Rose's Cafe. Theresa knocked on the door, and after a moment, it opened to reveal a plump, middle-aged woman with a kind face. "Theresa, what in heaven's name?" The woman looked from Theresa to Mason, taking in their disheveled appearance. "Another fight at the Silver Dollar." "I'm afraid so, Rose," Theresa admitted. "This is Mr. Turner. He came to my defense when Hargrove wouldn't take no for an answer." Rose's expression softened. "Well, any man willing to stand up to that snake is welcome in my cafe. Come in, come in. I'll put on some coffee." The cafe was small but cozy, with checkered tablecloths and the lingering aroma of fresh baked bread. Rose bustled about, lighting lamps and stoking the small stove, while Mason and Theresa sat at a corner table. "Thank you for what you did back there," Theresa said, her voice softer now that they were away from the chaos of the saloon. "Most men in this town either avoid me or, well, they have certain expectations." Mason studied her face in the lamplight. She was beautiful, but there was a weariness in her eyes, a hardness that spoke of difficult times. "I don't know you, Miss West, and I don't know your story. But no one deserves to be spoken to the way Hargrove was speaking to you." Rose returned with 2 cups of steaming coffee and a plate of biscuits. "On the house," she said with a warm smile, "for the hero of the evening." After Rose retreated to the back room, Theresa wrapped her hands around her coffee cup, as if drawing strength from its warmth. "I should tell you who I am, Mr. Turner. This is a small town, and you'll hear it from someone else if not from me." Mason took a sip of his coffee. "Only if you want to." She seemed to appreciate his response. My father was indeed a prospector. He came to Silver Ridge when I was just a child, convinced he'd strike it rich. My mother died when I was 14, and my father, he turned to drinking and gambling. He accumulated debts all over town. She paused, taking a deep breath. When he died 3 years ago, he left me with nothing but those debts and a tarnished name. The respectable businesses in town wouldn't hire me. The only place that would was the Silver Dollar. I serve drinks and play the piano sometimes. I don't. I'm not one of the girls who goes upstairs with the customers. But in a town like this, people don't always make that distinction. Mason nodded, understanding dawning. And Hargrove owns half the businesses in Silver Ridge, including the Saloon, Theresa explained. He's been trying to persuade me to become his companion for months. He thinks because of where I work and who my father was, I should be grateful for his attention. Some men confuse wealth with worth, Mason said, his voice hard. I've met plenty like him on the trail. A small smile touched Theresa's lips. And what about you, Mr. Turner? What brings a cowboy like you to Silver Ridge? Mason leaned back in his chair, stretching his long legs. I've been driving cattle up from Texas. The herd's camped outside town with the rest of the outfit. I'm just passing through, heading to Montana to start my own ranch. Your own ranch? There was genuine interest in her voice. That sounds like a dream worth pursuing. For the next hour, they talked about Mason's plans for his ranch, about Theresa's memories of her mother and the happier days before her father's decline, about the books they'd read, and the places they'd seen. Rose brought more coffee and the night grew deeper, but neither seemed to notice the passage of time. When they finally stood to leave, dawn was breaking over the eastern horizon, painting the sky in soft pinks and golds. I should get back, Theresa said reluctantly. I have a small room above the general store. The owner, Mrs. Thompson, is a kind soul who doesn't judge me too harshly. Mason nodded, suddenly realizing he didn't want to say goodbye just yet. May I walk you there? The streets were beginning to come alive as they walked a few early risers heading to work, shopkeepers sweeping their storefronts. They reached the general store, and Theresa stopped at the side entrance that led to the rooms above. Thank you again, Mr. Turner, for everything. She hesitated, then added, How long will you be in Silver Ridge? A few days, Mason replied. The men and the cattle need rest before we continue north. Theresa nodded, a hint of disappointment in her eyes. Well, should you find yourself at the Silver Dollar again, I'd be happy to serve you a drink on the house. It's the least I can do. Mason tipped his hat. I might just take you up on that offer, Miss West. As he walked back to where he'd left his horse, Mason found himself smiling. Silver Ridge, it seemed, might be worth a longer stay than he'd planned. The next evening, Mason returned to the Silver Dollar Saloon, his curiosity about Theresa West drawing him back like a moth to flame. He'd spent the day checking on the herd and conferring with his trail boss, but his thoughts had continually drifted to the auburn-haired woman with the fierce spirit. The saloon was quieter tonight, with just a handful of patrons scattered at the tables. A different energy filled the room as the soft notes of a piano drifted through the air. Mason's eyes were drawn to the corner where Theresa sat at an upright piano, her fingers dancing across the keys with surprising skill. She wore the same modest dress as the night before, but her hair was arranged differently, with soft tendrils framing her face. Her expression as she played was one of pure concentration, almost transcendent, as if the music transported her far from the dingy saloon. Mason found a seat at a table with a clear view of the piano and ordered a whiskey from a passing waitress. He was content to sit and listen, watching the transformation that came over Theresa as she played. This wasn't the defiant woman from last night's brawl, nor the vulnerable one who had shared her story at Rose's cafe. This was an artist, lost in her craft. When she finished the piece, a smattering of applause broke out. Theresa looked up and her eyes met Mason's across the room. A smile bloomed on her face, and she nodded in acknowledgement before beginning another tune. Mason nursed his whiskey, enjoying the music and the relative peace. Hargrove and his men were nowhere to be seen, which suited him just fine. After about an hour, Theresa rose from the piano and made her way to his table. "Mr. Turner," she greeted him, her cheeks slightly flushed from her performance. "I wasn't sure you'd return after last night's welcome." Mason gestured to the empty chair across from him. "It would take more than a little scuffle to keep me away from good music." She sat down, arranging her skirts with a practiced motion. "You flatter me. I'm self-taught, I'm afraid. My mother played and I picked up what I could before she passed." "She taught you well," Mason said sincerely. "It's not often I hear playing of that quality in establishments like this." A hint of sadness crossed Theresa's face. She had dreams of me playing in proper concert halls one day. Life had other plans. Before Mason could respond, the bartender approached their table. "Miss West, when you're ready, there are glasses to be washed." Theresa nodded. "Of course, Mr. Jenkins, I'll be right there." She turned back to Mason with an apologetic smile. "Duty calls, I'm afraid." "Perhaps we could continue our conversation another time," Mason suggested. "I'm staying in town for a few more days and I'd like to hear more about your music." The flush in her cheeks deepened. "I'd like that, Mr. Turner." "Mason," he corrected gently. "My friends call me Mason." "Then I'd like that, Mason," she said, her voice soft. "I finish here at 10. If you'd care to walk me home again." "I'd be honored, Theresa." As she walked away to attend to her duties, Mason found himself watching her, noting the grace with which she moved through the crowded room, the polite but firm way she rebuffed unwanted advances from patrons, the genuine smile she offered to the few regulars who treated her with respect. The hours passed, and Mason sipped his whiskey slowly, declining offers to join various poker games. He was content to observe the ebb and flow of the saloon, occasionally catching Theresa's eye as she worked. At precisely 10 o'clock she appeared at his table once more, a small shawl draped over her shoulders. "Ready?" she asked, her voice betraying a hint of tiredness. Outside, the night was cool and clear, the stars spread out above them like diamonds on black velvet. They walked slowly, in no rush to reach their destination. "Tell me about your ranch," Theresa said after a comfortable silence. "What will it be like?" Mason smiled, his eyes looking toward the distant horizon as if he could already see it. "I've purchased land near the Yellowstone River. Good water, good grass. I've been saving for years, working cattle drives, taking odd jobs. The land is mine, but I need a good herd to start with. That's why I'm driving these cattle north." "It sounds wonderful," Theresa said, genuine warmth in her voice. "A place of your own, built with your own hands." "It's been my dream since I was a boy," Mason admitted. "My father was a tenant farmer in Texas. We worked someone else's land all my life. I swore I'd have something of my own one day." Theresa nodded in understanding. "Dreams are powerful things. They keep us going when times are hard." "What about you?" Mason asked, curious. What dreams keep Theresa West going? She was quiet for a moment, considering his question. "I dream of leaving Silver Ridge," she finally said. "Of finding a place where no one knows my father's name or judges me for working in a saloon. I save every penny I can, but it's slow going." "Where would you go if you could go anywhere?" A soft laugh escaped her. "San Francisco, perhaps, or Denver. Somewhere with concert halls and libraries. Somewhere I could start fresh." They had reached the general store, but neither made a move to part ways. Instead, they stood in the shadows of the building, continuing their conversation as if reluctant to end the evening. "What would it take?" Mason asked. "To leave Silver Ridge, I mean." "How much are you saving for?" Theresa sighed. "It's not just about the money for passage. I need enough to establish myself somewhere new, to rent a room and live until I find work. And—" she hesitated. "There are still some of my father's debts. Mr. Jenkins at the saloon has been kind enough to let me work them off gradually, but I won't leave until they're paid." Mason nodded, admiring her integrity. Many would have simply fled, leaving the debts behind. "That's honorable." "It's necessary," she corrected. "I want a fresh start, not to run from my responsibilities." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the distant howl of a coyote. "I should let you rest," Mason finally said, though he found himself reluctant to leave her company. "Will I see you tomorrow?" Theresa asked, a hint of vulnerability in her question. Mason smiled. "Wild horses couldn't keep me away." The following days fell into a pattern. Mason would spend his mornings and afternoons with the herd, working alongside his men to ensure the cattle were well rested and ready for the next leg of the journey. In the evenings, he would go to the Silver Dollar, listen to Theresa play the piano, and then walk her home, their conversations growing deeper and more personal with each passing night. He learned about her childhood dreams, her favorite books, the small joys that brightened her difficult life, the first wildflowers of spring, the taste of fresh baked bread, the satisfaction of mastering a difficult piano piece. In turn, he shared stories of his travels, the characters he'd met on the trail, his plans for the ranch in Montana. On the fourth night, as they walked back to the general store, Theresa grew quiet, more subdued than usual. "Is something wrong?" Mason asked, concerned by her change in demeanor. Theresa hesitated, then spoke softly. "You'll be leaving soon, won't you, continuing north with your herd?" Mason nodded slowly. "The cattle are rested. We should move on in the next day or two." She forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Of course. You have your dream to pursue." "I understand." They reached the general store and stopped. The night was warmer than usual, with a gentle breeze rustling the leaves of a nearby oak tree. In the moonlight, Theresa's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "Theresa," Mason began, his voice low, "these past few days, I've never met anyone quite like you." She looked up at him, vulnerability plain on her face. "Nor I you. You've been a true friend, Mason. That's rare in a place like this." Friend. The word felt insufficient for what had grown between them. Mason took a step closer to her, his heart pounding in his chest. "I don't want to say goodbye," he admitted. "Not yet." Theresa's breath caught. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying." Mason paused, gathering his courage. "I'm saying that I care for you, Theresa West, more than I expected to. More than I should, perhaps, given the circumstances." Her eyes widened, a mix of hope and fear in their depths. "Mason," before she could finish, the sound of approaching footsteps interrupted them. They turned to see three men walking down the street, their gait unsteady from drink. One of them was Hargrove. Well, Hargrove's voice was thick with alcohol and malice. "If it isn't the piano player and her cowboy defender, how touching." Mason instinctively moved to stand in front of Theresa, his hand dropping to his holster. "Evening, gentlemen." "We were just saying good night." Hargrove sneered. "I'm sure you were. Tell me, Cowboy, does she charge you for her company, or do you get it for free because you threw a few punches in her honor?" Mason felt rage building inside him, but Theresa's hand on his arm steadied him. "He's not worth it," she whispered. "Please, Mason." Hargrove noticed the gesture and laughed. "Oh, I see how it is. She's got you wrapped around her finger, doesn't she? Just like she did with half the men in town before you came along." Mason's jaw clenched. You should move along, Hargrove. Sleep off that whiskey. But Hargrove wasn't finished. He took a step closer, his companions flanking him. You know, I've been doing some asking around about you, Turner. Seems you're driving cattle north, aiming to start a ranch in Montana. Ambitious. He smiled, a cold, calculating expression. Be a shame if something happened to that herd before you got there. Mason felt a chill run down his spine. It wasn't an idle threat. Cattle rustling was common, and a man like Hargrove would have connections with outlaws who wouldn't hesitate to steal or scatter a herd for the right price. Are you threatening me, Hargrove? Mason's voice was dangerously quiet. Hargrove shrugged, feigning innocence. Just making conversation. This territory can be dangerous. All sorts of accidents happen to men and their property. His gaze shifted to Theresa. And to women who don't know their place. Mason's hand tightened on his gun, but Theresa stepped forward, her voice steady despite the fear he could see in her eyes. That's enough, Mr. Hargrove. You're drunk, and you're saying things you'll regret in the morning. Go home. Hargrove's face darkened. Don't tell me what to do, you. Is there a problem here? A new voice interrupted, and they all turned to see Sheriff Daniel Morales approaching, his badge gleaming in the moonlight. Hargrove immediately straightened, adopting a more civil tone. No problem at all, Sheriff. Just having a friendly chat with Miss West and her friend. Sheriff Morales looked skeptical. It's late for friendly chats in the street. Why don't you and your friends head on home, Mr. Hargrove? For a moment it seemed Hargrove might argue, but then he nodded curtly. Of course, Sheriff. Just leaving. He shot Mason a venomous look. We'll continue our conversation another time, Turner. As Hargrove and his companion staggered away, Sheriff Morales turned to Mason and Theresa. Everything all right, Miss West? Theresa nodded, visibly relieved. Yes, thank you, Sheriff. Mr. Hargrove had a bit too much to drink, that's all. He's been making trouble more than usual lately, the sheriff observed. You two be careful, I can't be everywhere at once. After the sheriff continued on his rounds, Mason turned to Theresa, concern etched on his face. He threatened you. This isn't just about me or my cattle. Theresa sighed, suddenly looking tired. Hargrove doesn't like being refused. When I first started working at the Silver Dollar, he made his intentions clear. When I rejected him, he started spreading rumors about me, making my reputation even worse than it already was. Has he threatened you before? Mason asked, anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. Not directly. Not until tonight. She looked up at him, her expression serious. Mason, you should leave tomorrow, take your herd and go. Hargrove has connections with some unsavory characters. I don't want you or your livelihood in danger because of me. Mason shook his head. I'm not leaving you here with that man making threats. I've handled Hargrove for 3 years, Theresa insisted. I'll continue to handle him after you're gone. You shouldn't have to. Mason's voice was firm. No one should have to live under constant threat. Theresa's eyes softened. That's a nice sentiment, Mason, but this is the reality of my life, at least until I can save enough to leave. An idea began to form in Mason's mind, crazy and impulsive, but growing more compelling by the second. What if you didn't have to wait? What do you mean? Mason took a deep breath. Come with me, to Montana. Theresa stared at him, shock evident on her face. Mason, we've only known each other for days. Sometimes days are enough to know what matters, he said, the words coming from a place of pure conviction. I'm not offering charity, Theresa, I'm offering a choice. A partnership, if you will. A partnership, she repeated, confusion in her voice. I need help building my ranch, Mason explained, the plan solidifying as he spoke. It's hard work starting from nothing, and from what I've seen, you're no stranger to hard work. Theresa looked stunned. You're asking me to work for you, Mason shook his head. No, I'm asking you to work with me, as equals. You said you want a fresh start. I'm offering you one in a place where no one knows your father's name or cares about your past." Hope flickered in Theresa's eyes, quickly replaced by doubt. "But what about my father's debts? I can't just leave them unpaid." "How much do you still owe?" Mason asked. Theresa hesitated, then named a sum that represented several months of her wages at the saloon. It was a substantial amount, but not impossible. "I can cover that," Mason said without hesitation. "Consider it an advance on your share of the ranch." "My share?" Theresa's voice was barely above a whisper. "Mason, what exactly are you proposing?" He met her gaze directly. "I'm proposing that we build something together, Theresa. A ranch, a home, a life. I know it's sudden and I know it's asking a lot of you to trust me, but these past few days, I've felt something I've never felt before, and I hope you feel it too." Tears welled in Theresa's eyes. "This is madness," she whispered. "Complete madness." "Maybe," Mason agreed with a small smile. "But sometimes madness is exactly what's needed to change a life." Theresa looked away, her mind clearly racing with the implications of his offer. "I need time to think, Mason. This isn't a decision I can make on a street corner at midnight." Mason nodded, understanding. "Of course. We're not leaving until the day after tomorrow. Take all the time you need." She gave him a tremulous smile. "Good night, Mason. Good night, Theresa." As Mason walked back to the camp where his men and cattle were settled, his mind was in turmoil. Had he been too impulsive? Too forward? He hardly knew Theresa, and yet he felt as if he'd known her all his life. There was a connection between them that defied explanation, a sense of recognition that went beyond the physical attraction he undeniably felt. The next day passed in a blur of preparations for the journey ahead. Mason settled accounts in town, purchased additional supplies, and conferred with his trail boss about the route north. All the while, his thoughts kept returning to Theresa, wondering what decision she would make. Evening found him once again at the Silver Dollar, but Theresa wasn't at her usual place at the piano. Concerned, Mason approached the bartender. "Evening, Mr. Jenkins. Is Miss West not working tonight?" Jenkins gave him a curious look. "No, she came in earlier to collect her wages and said she needed the night off. First time in 3 years she's asked for such a thing." Mason felt a mixture of hope and anxiety. Had she decided to accept his offer, or was she avoiding him because she planned to refuse? He spent an hour nursing a single whiskey, then decided to check on her. The walk to the general store seemed longer than usual, his mind racing with possibilities. When he arrived, he was relieved to see a light in the window of her room above the store. Mason hesitated, then knocked on the side door that led to the upstairs rooms. After a moment, Mrs. Thompson, the store owner, answered. "Mr. Turner," she greeted him, recognition in her eyes. "Are you looking for Miss West?" "Yes, madam, if she's available." Mrs. Thompson nodded. "She mentioned you might call. Come in, I'll let her know you're here." Mason waited in a small sitting room while Mrs. Thompson went upstairs. A few minutes later, Theresa appeared, wearing a simple dress of soft green that he hadn't seen before. Her hair was down, falling in waves past her shoulders, and she looked both nervous and determined. "Mason," she said, her voice steady, "thank you for coming." "I was worried when you weren't at the saloon," he admitted. She gestured for him to sit, taking a seat across from him. "I needed time to think, as I said, and to make some arrangements." Mason's heart beat faster. "Arrangements?" Theresa took a deep breath. "I went to see Mr. Jenkins this morning. I paid off the remainder of my father's debt to him." Mason's eyebrows rose in surprise. "All of it? How?" "I've been saving for 3 years, Mason. I had most of what I needed, and Mrs. Thompson kindly advanced me the rest against some items of my mother's that have sentimental value to me, but which I would have had to sell eventually." So you're free of your obligations here, Mason said, trying to keep the hope from his voice. Theresa nodded. Yes. For the first time since my father died, I am beholden to no one in Silver Ridge. Mason leaned forward, his eyes searching hers. And have you decided what you'll do with that freedom? A small smile played at the corners of her mouth. I've been thinking about your offer, about Montana and your ranch and everything else you proposed. And Mason could barely breathe. And I think you're right. Sometimes madness is exactly what's needed to change a life. Her smile grew wider. I'll come with you to Montana, Mason Turner. I'll help you build your ranch and we'll see what grows between us along with the crops and the cattle. Joy surged through Mason, so intense he could scarcely contain it. You won't regret it, Theresa, I promise you that. I have conditions, she said, her expression turning serious. First, I pay my own way. The money I was saving to leave Silver Ridge will be my contribution to our partnership. I won't be a charity case. Mason nodded. Agreed. What else? Second, if at any point I decide Montana or you and I together isn't what I want, you'll help me get to San Francisco or Denver as we discussed. Of course, Mason said without hesitation. I want you to choose this freely, Theresa. Always. Her expression softened. And third, I'd like to take my mother's piano. It's been in storage since we lost our home. It's the one thing of hers that I couldn't bear to part with. Mason smiled. A ranch needs music. We'll make room for it on one of the wagons. Theresa's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. Then it's settled. We leave tomorrow, at first light, Mason confirmed. Pack whatever you need. We'll collect the piano in the morning. They sat in silence for a moment, the magnitude of their decision settling over them. Then, slowly, Mason reached across the space between them and took her hand in his. Her fingers were slender but strong, the hands of a woman who knew hard work but also the delicate touch needed for music. I won't let you down, Theresa, he said softly. She squeezed his hand. Nor I you, Mason. The dawn broke clear and cool over Silver Ridge as Mason and his men prepared to depart. The cattle were gathered, the wagons loaded, and an air of anticipation hung over the camp. Mason had explained to his trail boss, a grizzled veteran named Hank, that they would be taking on a passenger and her piano for the journey north. Hank had raised an eyebrow but asked no questions. He'd worked with Mason long enough to trust his judgment, even when it came to bringing a saloon pianist on a cattle drive. Mason rode into town on Thunder, leading a wagon for Theresa's belongings. They had agreed to meet at the general store at sunrise, and he arrived to find her already waiting, a small trunk at her feet. She wore a practical traveling dress and sturdy boots, with a wide-brimmed hat to shield her from the sun. Good morning, Mason greeted her, dismounting. Ready for an adventure? Theresa smiled, though he could see the nervousness in her eyes. As ready as I'll ever be. They loaded her trunk onto the wagon, then headed to the storage facility where her mother's piano was kept. It took 4 men to carefully load the instrument onto a second wagon, securing it with ropes and padding to protect it during the journey. As they were finishing, Mason noticed a commotion down the street. A group of men had gathered outside the Silver Dollar, and at their center was Hargrove, gesticulating wildly. We should go, Mason said quietly to Theresa. Quickly. But it was too late. Hargrove had spotted them and was striding toward them, his face flushed with anger. So it's true, he spat when he reached them. You're running off with the cowboy. Theresa straightened her spine, facing him squarely. I'm leaving Silver Ridge, Mr. Hargrove. My business here is concluded. Your business? Hargrove laughed harshly. What about your obligations? Your father's debts, paid in full, Theresa replied calmly. You're welcome to verify with Mr. Jenkins and the others. Hargrove's eyes narrowed. You think you can just walk away? After all the special treatment I gave you at the saloon, Mason stepped forward. The lady is free to go where she pleases, Hargrove. Your special treatment wasn't charity, it was investment in your own interests. Stay out of this, Turner, Hargrove snarled. This is between me and her. Not anymore, Mason said, his hand hovering near his holster. Theresa is under my protection now. Hargrove's face contorted with rage. Protection? Is that what they're calling it these days? She's nothing but choose your next words very carefully, Mason interrupted, his voice dangerously low. I've defended her name once in your saloon. I won't hesitate to do it again, right here in the street. A crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the confrontation. Among them, Mason spotted Sheriff Morales watching closely. Hargrove glanced around, noting the audience. You think you can just ride out of here? I have friends along the trail north. Friends who would be very interested to know about a rich herd of cattle heading their way. Is that a threat, Mr. Hargrove? Sheriff Morales stepped forward, his hand on his own gun. Because it sounds like you're planning to arrange some cattle rustling, which is a hanging offense in this territory. Hargrove paled slightly. I was just pointing out the dangers of the trail, Sheriff. No threat intended. Good, the sheriff replied. Because I'd hate to have to telegraph my colleagues in Montana to be on the lookout for any suspicious activity connected to you. Hargrove's jaw clenched, but he said nothing more. Miss West, the sheriff continued, turning to Theresa. I understand you've settled all your affairs in Silver Ridge. Theresa nodded. Yes, Sheriff, all debts paid, all obligations fulfilled. Then I wish you safe travels. He tipped his hat to her, then gave Mason a measuring look. Take care of her, Turner. She's one of the few decent folks this town had. I intend to, Sheriff, Mason replied with a nod of respect. With the sheriff's tacit approval, the crowd began to disperse. Hargrove remained glaring at them both. This isn't over, he said quietly for their ears only. Not by a long shot. Yes, it is, Theresa replied, her voice firm. Goodbye, Mr. Hargrove. I hope you find peace someday. With that, she allowed Mason to help her onto the wagon seat. He climbed up beside her, took the reins, and with a final nod to the sheriff, set the horses in motion. The wagon with the piano followed, driven by one of Mason's men. As they left Silver Ridge behind, Theresa didn't look back. Her gaze was fixed firmly on the horizon, on the future that awaited them in Montana. The journey north was arduous, but not without its moments of beauty and joy. The cattle drive moved at a steady pace, covering 15 to 20 miles on good days. Theresa quickly adapted to the rhythm of life on the trail, earning the respect of Mason's men with her resilience and willingness to help with cooking and other camp duties. In the evenings, after the cattle were settled and dinner was eaten, she would sometimes play her violin, a more portable instrument that she had brought along for the journey, as the piano remained securely packed in the wagon. The haunting melodies drifted over the camp, soothing both men and beasts after the long days. As they traveled, Mason and Theresa's relationship deepened. They spent hours riding side by side, sharing stories and dreams, learning each other's strengths and weaknesses. Mason discovered that beneath Theresa's refined exterior lay a practical, determined woman who wasn't afraid of hard work. Theresa, in turn, found that Mason's quiet strength came with a surprising gentleness, and a mind that valued books and ideas as much as she did. They crossed through Wyoming territory, following the winding path of rivers, navigating mountain passes, and traversing vast stretches of open prairie. The landscape grew more dramatic as they pushed north, towering peaks in the distance, forests of pine and fir, valleys lush with spring growth. One evening, about 3 weeks into their journey, They made camp near a clear, rushing stream at the base of a small mountain range. The cattle were grazing peacefully, and the men were relaxing around the campfire after a supper of beans, bacon, and biscuits. Theresa had walked a short distance from the camp to watch the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. Mason found her there, standing with her arms wrapped around herself against the cooling evening air. "It's beautiful," she said as he approached. "I never imagined such grandeur existed." Mason stood beside her, taking in the vista. "That's what drew me to Montana. The land here has a power to it, a presence that gets under your skin." Theresa glanced at him, a small smile playing at her lips. "It suits you, this wild country." "I hope it will suit you too," Mason said, suddenly anxious. "It's not an easy life I'm offering you, Theresa. Building a ranch from nothing will be harder than anything you've done before." She turned to face him fully, her expression serious. "Do you think I came this far because I was looking for an easy life? I came because I want something real, Mason. Something I've built with my own hands, something that's mine by right of work and not by accident of birth or circumstance." Mason felt a surge of admiration for her. "You're the strongest woman I've ever known." Theresa laughed softly. "Not the most ladylike compliment I've received, but perhaps the most meaningful." The last rays of sunlight caught in her hair, turning the auburn strands to fire. Mason reached out almost without thinking and tucked a loose strand behind her ear. His hand lingered, cupping her cheek gently. "Theresa," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I know we agreed to see what grows between us, to give ourselves time, but I need you to know. I'm already certain of my feelings." Her eyes widened, but she didn't pull away from his touch. "Mason, I love you," he said simply. "I think I've loved you since that first night in the saloon when you fought beside me instead of cowering behind me. I've certainly loved you more with each day on this journey." Theresa's eyes filled with tears, but they were accompanied by a smile that took his breath away. "I've been afraid to trust these feelings," she admitted. "It all happened so quickly, and I've been disappointed before. But out here, away from Silver Ridge, away from the past, I can finally admit the truth to myself, and to you." She placed her hand over his where it still rested against her cheek. "I love you too, Mason Turner, with a certainty that should frighten me but somehow doesn't." Mason felt as if his heart might burst with happiness. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned down and pressed his lips to hers in a gentle kiss. Theresa responded with a sweetness that made his knees weak, her free hand coming up to rest against his chest. When they finally parted, both breathless, Mason rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he whispered. "Not someday, not when the ranch is built, but now, as soon as we reach Montana." Theresa pulled back slightly, searching his face. "Are you certain? You don't think we should wait?" Mason shook his head. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life. I want to build our home together as husband and wife. I want to fall asleep beside you each night and wake up to your face each morning." A joyous laugh escaped her. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and confident. "Yes, I'll marry you, Mason Turner." He kissed her again, pulling her close against him as the last light faded from the sky and the first stars began to appear overhead. The remaining weeks of their journey were filled with a new energy, a sense of purpose and joy that made even the hardest days seem easier. Mason and Theresa made no secret of their engagement among the trail hands, who responded with good-natured teasing and genuine congratulations. They reached Montana territory in late June, when the land was at its most verdant. The Yellowstone River Valley stretched before them, a lush paradise of grassland bordered by distant mountains and forests. When they crested the final hill, and Mason pointed out the boundaries of his land, Theresa gasped in wonder. "It's even more beautiful than you described," she said, taking in the rolling meadows, the clear river that cut through the property, the stand of cottonwood trees that would provide shade and shelter. Mason squeezed her hand. "It's ours now, our home." They made camp by the river, and over the next few days, the men helped Mason begin the work of setting up the ranch. They constructed a temporary shelter, a sturdy tent reinforced with timber that would house Mason and Theresa until a proper cabin could be built. They set up corrals for the cattle, marked out the boundaries of fields to be plowed, and dug the beginnings of a well. A week after their arrival, Hank and most of the trail hands prepared to depart, heading back south for another cattle drive. 3 men elected to stay on, hired as the first employees of the Turner Ranch. On their final night together, Hank approached Mason and Theresa as they sat by the campfire. "I've been thinking," the old trail boss said, shifting uncomfortably from foot to foot. "It ain't right, you two starting your life together without proper vows." Theresa looked puzzled. "We plan to ride to the nearest town with a preacher as soon as things are settled here." Hank nodded. "That's all well and good, but that could be weeks yet. And it occurs to me that I'm authorized to perform marriages, being a ship's captain in my younger days." Mason raised an eyebrow in surprise. "You were a sea captain, Hank. You never mentioned that." Hank shrugged. "Was a lifetime ago, but the authority stays with you. So if you're amenable, I could marry you proper before we ride out tomorrow." Mason looked at Theresa, a question in his eyes. She smiled and nodded, her expression radiant. "I'd be honored, Captain Hank," she said warmly. And so, on a perfect Montana evening, with the sun setting over the mountains and the river murmuring its eternal song, Mason Turner and Theresa West were married. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, with Hank reciting the traditional vows from memory and the trail hands serving as witnesses. Theresa wore her best dress, with wildflowers woven into her hair. Mason had shaved and put on a clean shirt, his usually unruly hair tamed for the occasion. When Hank pronounced them husband and wife, the men let out a cheer that startled a flock of birds from a nearby tree. That night, in the privacy of their tent, Mason and Theresa consummated their marriage with a tenderness and passion that left them both breathless. As they lay together afterward, Theresa's head resting on Mason's chest, he stroked her hair and marveled at the journey that had brought them to this moment. "Are you happy, Mrs. Turner?" he asked softly. Theresa lifted her head to look at him, her eyes shining in the dim light. "Happier than I ever dreamed possible, Mr. Turner." The next morning they bid farewell to Hank and the departing trail hands. As the dust from their horses faded in the distance, Mason turned to Theresa, to the 3 ranch hands who remained, and to the vast, promising land that stretched before them. "Well," he said, his arm around his wife's waist, "let's build a ranch." The following months were a whirlwind of backbreaking work and immeasurable reward. Mason and the hands constructed a sturdy log cabin before the first snow, with 2 rooms and a stone fireplace. Theresa's piano was carefully moved into the main room, where its music filled their home on cold winter evenings. They plowed fields, planted a vegetable garden, built more substantial corrals and a barn for the cattle and the horses. Theresa proved to be as capable and hardworking as Mason had expected, learning to rope and ride, to cook over an open fire, to tend to injured animals, and to manage the household accounts with precision. The nearest town was a day's ride away, but they made the journey once a month for supplies and news. On one such trip in late summer, they met the local school teacher, a kind woman named Mrs. Reynolds, who was delighted to discover Theresa's musical talent. She invited Theresa to teach piano to her students once a week, an opportunity that Theresa eagerly accepted. These weekly trips to town became a source of joy for Theresa, connecting her to a broader community and allowing her to share her love of music. She would return to the ranch energized, full of stories about her students and the latest news from the growing settlement. As autumn turned to winter, the land transformed under a blanket of snow. The work of the ranch slowed but did not cease entirely. There were still animals to tend, repairs to make, plans to draw up for the spring planting. In the evenings, Mason and Theresa would sit by the fire, reading books they'd ordered from back east, playing chess, or simply talking about their dreams for the future. One such evening, as a blizzard howled outside their snug cabin, Theresa set aside her mending and looked at Mason with a mix of nervousness and excitement. "Mason," she began, her voice soft, "I have something to tell you." He looked up from the ledger where he'd been calculating expenses for the coming year. "What is it, love?" Theresa took a deep breath. "I believe we'll need to add another room to the cabin by summer's end." Mason's brow furrowed in confusion. "Another room? What for?" A smile bloomed on Theresa's face. "For the newest Turner. I'm with child, Mason." For a moment Mason sat perfectly still, her words sinking in. Then he was on his feet, crossing to her chair in 2 long strides, and lifting her into his arms with a whoop of joy that startled their dog from its slumber by the fire. "A baby," he said, his voice filled with wonder as he set her gently back on her feet. "We're having a baby." Theresa nodded, tears of happiness in her eyes. "Dr. Miller confirmed it when I was in town yesterday. He says the baby should arrive in late June or early July." Mason placed a hand reverently on her still flat stomach. "A son or daughter," he marveled. "A child to inherit all we're building here." "Our legacy," Theresa agreed, covering his hand with her own. "A family of our own making with no shadows from the past." As the winter months passed, Theresa's body changed, her stomach growing round with new life. Mason fussed over her, insisting she rest more, though she stubbornly continued with most of her usual tasks, adapting as needed to accommodate her changing shape. Spring brought new growth to the land and new developments for the ranch. Word had spread about the quality of Turner cattle, and buyers began to seek them out. Mason hired 2 more hands to help with the expanding operation. The vegetable garden doubled in size under Theresa's direction, and she started a small orchard of apple and cherry trees that would bear fruit in years to come. As Theresa's due date approached, Mason built a cradle from pine wood, carving delicate designs of mountains and rivers into the headboard. Theresa sewed tiny garments from soft flannel, and Mrs. Reynolds organized the women of the town to create a beautiful quilt as a gift for the coming baby. On a warm July morning, with the sun just beginning to crest the eastern mountains, Theresa went into labor. Mason sent one of the hands racing for the midwife in town, while he stayed by his wife's side, holding her hand through the initial pains. The midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Dawson, arrived by midday, shooing Mason out of the bedroom with firm instructions to keep water boiling and clean linens ready. He paced the cabin floor for hours, wincing at each cry from the bedroom, praying to a God he hadn't spoken to in years. As the sun began to set, a new sound filled the cabin, the lusty cry of a newborn taking its first breath. Mason froze, his heart pounding, until Mrs. Dawson emerged from the bedroom, a smile on her tired face. "Congratulations, Mr. Turner," she said. "You have a healthy daughter." Mason could scarcely breathe. "And Theresa, tired but well, she's asking for you." He entered the bedroom on shaky legs. Theresa lay propped up on pillows, her face pale but radiant, a small bundle cradled in her arms. She looked up as he approached, her smile so full of love it nearly brought him to his knees. "Come meet your daughter," she said softly. Mason sat carefully on the edge of the bed, peering at the tiny face nestled against Theresa's breast. The baby had a dusting of dark hair, pink cheeks, and when she opened her eyes, he saw they were the same deep blue as his own. "She's perfect," he whispered, gently touching a finger to his daughter's tiny hand. The baby reflexively grasped it, her grip surprisingly strong. "What shall we name her?" Theresa looked down at their child with tenderness. "I was thinking of Eleanor after my mother, Eleanor Rose Turner." "Eleanor," Mason repeated, testing the name. "It suits her, strong but beautiful like her mother." He leaned down to kiss Theresa's forehead, then the top of their daughter's head. In that moment, Mason Turner knew a completeness he had never imagined possible. From a chance encounter in a saloon to this perfect circle of family, his life had transformed in ways he could never have predicted. "I love you," he said to Theresa, his voice thick with emotion. "Both of you more than I can express." Theresa reached up to touch his cheek. "And we love you, Mason Turner, our protector, our provider, our home." As the years passed, the Turner ranch prospered and grew. They added onto the cabin, eventually building a proper house with multiple bedrooms, a dedicated music room for Theresa's piano, and a study where Mason kept the ranch accounts. The original cabin became a bunkhouse for the ranch hands, who now numbered 8 during the busy seasons. Eleanor grew into a spirited, intelligent girl with her father's blue eyes and her mother's auburn hair. She learned to ride almost before she could walk, and by the age of 6, she could play simple tunes on her mother's piano and help her father with the gentler livestock. 2 years after Eleanor's birth, Theresa gave birth to a son whom they named William. He was followed 3 years later by another daughter, Margaret. The Turner children filled the ranch with laughter and music, growing strong and free in the Montana wilderness. Theresa continued to teach music in town, her students now including her own children. She also wrote articles for the local newspaper and occasionally for publications back east, describing life on the frontier with a vividness and honesty that earned her a modest reputation as a writer. Mason expanded the ranch operations, breeding horses as well as cattle, and experimenting with new farming techniques. The Turner brand became known throughout the territory for quality and fair dealing. When the railway came through the nearby town, connecting them more directly to markets in the east, the ranch's prosperity was assured. They never forgot the strange twist of fate that had brought them together, a saloon brawl in a small Wyoming town, where a cowboy had fought to defend a lady's name. Sometimes, on the anniversary of that night, Mason would take Theresa in his arms and dance her around their living room to the music of her piano, played by their eldest daughter. "You ever regret it?" he asked her once, as they stood on the porch of their home, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold. "Leaving Silver Ridge with a man you barely knew on the promise of a dream." Theresa leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. "Not for a single moment," she replied. "You offered me more than a dream, Mason. You offered me a choice when I'd had so few in my life, and every day I choose this, our ranch, our family, our love." Mason wrapped his arm around her waist, pulling her close. "As do I, my love, as do I." And so they stood together, watching the day end and the stars begin to appear, their children's laughter drifting from the house behind them, their life together stretching before them like the vast Montana sky, boundless, beautiful, and full of promise. In time, the story of the cowboy who fought off every man in the saloon to defend her name became a family legend, told and retold to children and grandchildren. But Mason and Theresa knew that the real story, the daily choosing of love, the building of a life together through hardship and joy, was far more extraordinary than any saloon brawl could ever be. It was a love story written not in dramatic gestures, but in the quiet moments. Mason helping Theresa mount her horse despite her protestations that she was perfectly capable. Theresa playing Mason's favorite sonata on evenings when he returned weary from the fields. The two of them standing hand in hand at their children's birthdays, school performances, and eventually, weddings. As they grew older, their love deepened, weathering the inevitable storms of life, droughts that threatened the ranch, illnesses that confined them to bed, disagreements that tested their patience. Through it all, they remained each other's truest companion, strongest advocate, and most honest critic. When visitors came to the Turner Ranch, they often remarked on the palpable bond between Mason and Theresa. Even in their 60s, they would exchange glances across a room that held entire conversations, and their hands would find each other as naturally as breathing. On their 40th wedding anniversary, with their children and grandchildren gathered around them, Mason raised a glass in toast to his wife. "To Theresa," he said, his voice still strong despite the silver in his hair, "who took a chance on a dusty cowboy and turned him into the richest man in Montana, not in gold, but in love." Theresa's eyes, still as vibrant as the day they met, shimmered with tears as she raised her own glass. "And to Mason, who fought for my honor before he even knew my name, and has been fighting for my happiness every day since." Their legacy lived on not just in their children and the prosperous ranch they built, but in the example they set of courage, of taking chances on love, of building something meaningful from nothing but determination and shared dreams. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the grandchildren begged for a story, Theresa would sit at her beloved piano, her fingers still nimble despite the years, and begin to play a tune that had been popular in saloons long ago. Mason would smile, remembering a smoky room, a defiant woman, and the moment his life had changed forever. "Tell us again, Grandpa," the children would plead. "Tell us about the night you fought every man in the saloon just to defend Grandma's name." And Mason would wink at Theresa, who would hide her smile behind her hand, and begin the tale once more, embellished over the years, perhaps, but true in all the ways that mattered. The story of a chance encounter that led to a love strong enough to build a life, a family, and a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. For in the end, that was their greatest achievement, not the ranch, nor their children, but the love they chose day after day, year after year. A love that began with a defense of honor and grew into a bond that even time could not diminish. In the wild lands of Montana, under the vast blue sky, Mason and Theresa Turner wrote their own legend, one day at a time. And it was beautiful,